Texas Panhandle, 1873, the wind carried dust across the dry flatlands as midday sun beat down without mercy. Yates Prescott pulled his horse to a stop on the edge of a shallow gully, his sharp eyes narrowing at the sound of shouting below. He had been riding alone for 3 days, headed west from Fort Elliott with supplies tied to his saddle, when the noise caught his ear, men yelling, something angry, cruel. He slid from the saddle and crouched low, moving through the brush until the scene came clear. 3 settlers, grimy, drunk-looking, and laughing, stood in a ring around a woman on the ground. Her dark hair was tangled, her dress torn at the shoulder. One of them kicked at her ribs. She coughed hard, curling in, trying to shield herself. Yates did not think. He moved. He drew his Colt and fired once into the air. The crack echoed across the plain. The men froze, turning toward him. "Back off," Yates said, voice cold and low. One of them reached for his rifle, but Yates already had his sights on him. I said, "Back off." They dropped their weapons, nervous now. Yates stepped forward slowly, keeping his gun steady. "You got no right," one of them muttered. Yates stared him down. "You just beat a woman half to death. That's not a right, that's a sickness." He kicked their rifles away and motioned toward the open plains. "Get." "Before I change my mind." They went, slow like they wanted to argue, but Yates' calm stare didn't waver. When they were gone, swallowed up by the sun and dust, he holstered his gun and turned to the woman. She was still on the ground, one hand pressed to a split lip. Her eyes were wary, wide with fear. He bent down and held out a hand. "You're safe now. I swear to you, you'll never be hurt again." She hesitated, then took his hand. Her fingers were scraped and trembling, yet she gripped his hand with more strength than he expected. He pulled her gently to her feet. "Thank you," she whispered, voice hoarse. "They followed me from the wagon train. I ran, thought I could lose them." Yates nodded, steadying her with a hand under her elbow. "What's your name?" "Nella Vaught." Her voice cracked on the second word, like it had been too long since someone said it with care. Yates gave a small nod. "I'm Yates Prescott. You hurt anywhere bad?" She shook her head, but her knees buckled and he caught her before she hit the ground again. He didn't ask before lifting her into his arms. She stiffened at first, but then leaned into his chest with a soft, broken sigh. "I got a camp not far," he told her. "You can rest there, I'll keep watch." He walked back toward his horse, carrying her like she weighed nothing. She was quiet, watching his face with eyes that still held fear, but also something else, something softer. He laid her across his saddle carefully and led the horse toward a cluster of cottonwoods a half-mile east, where he had made camp the night before. When they reached it, he helped her down, set out a blanket, and got a canteen from his pack. She drank slowly, wincing when the water touched her cracked lips. "Was it just you out there?" he asked gently. Nella nodded. "I was traveling with my uncle's party, but I left." "They were not kind to me." Yates did not press. Her hands were shaking and her cheek was bruising purple where someone had struck her hard. He felt something inside him twist at the sight. "You have people west?" he asked. "No, no one," he nodded slowly, adding more wood to the fire. "Then stay with me for now. I'll get you safe to a town. You can decide from there." She looked at him then, really looked. "Why are you helping me?" Yates met her eyes. "Because I saw what they did, and I won't let that happen to you again." Nella blinked hard, then looked away. "You do not know me." "I do not need to." She curled her fingers around the blanket he handed her, staring into the flames. He watched her shoulders rise and fall, slow and steady, like she was trying to breathe through years of tension. After a long silence, she whispered, "They said I was nothing, that no one would care what they did." Yates stepped closer, crouched by the fire. "They were wrong." He sat beside her, not touching, just there. She glanced at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of peace in her eyes. That night she slept beside the fire while he kept watch, rifle across his lap. Coyotes called far in the distance, but none came near. When she stirred from a nightmare, he was already there, hand light on her shoulder, whispering soft reassurance. At dawn, Nella sat up and looked at him with more color in her cheeks. "You stayed awake all night." "I said I would keep watch." She stared at him a long time before her voice came, quiet but sure. "You did." He cooked breakfast, beans and coffee, and they shared it beside the fire. She had a small smile, tired but real. He caught himself watching her too long, the curve of her mouth, the way she wiped her hands on her skirt. They packed up as the sun climbed higher. "I do not know where I am going next," she said as he helped her onto the saddle again. "You do not have to know yet," he said. "Just ride with me a while." She nodded, her grip light on the saddle horn. They rode west, two strangers bound by something stronger than words. The land stretched wide and silent around them, but Nella kept glancing sideways at Yates, her eyes no longer filled with fear. And Yates, for the first time in years, felt something warm take root in his chest, something more than duty, something like hope. By the third day, the wind had shifted to the north, dry and sharp, like a blade drawn slow. The prairie flattened out into wheat-colored grasslands broken by low rises and the occasional mesquite. Yates rode ahead, reins looped loose in his left hand, his right resting near the butt of his rifle as always. Nella followed on his pack horse, sitting straighter now, her face touched by sun but not raw with it. She hadn't spoken much since the first night. Yates didn't mind. He understood quiet, understood how silence could be armor when words cost too much. Still, when the sky turned amber with the setting sun and they made camp near a spring-fed draw, he glanced her way. "You ride steady," he said, tossing down his bedroll. Most folks wouldn't have lasted this far. She was kneeling by the spring, rinsing the sweat from her neck. Her hair, darker now with dust and sweat, clung to her skin. She looked up, not startled, just thoughtful. "I've had to learn to manage," she said. "I never was anyone's delicate." Yates crouched beside the fire pit and struck flint to steel, sparks caught on dried brush. "You cook?" he asked. She nodded. "Enough to keep alive. I used to help my aunt with baking. She'd make sweet corn cakes come Sunday. Burnt half of them, but swore they were better that way." Yates set the coffee to boil and pulled a small tin of beans from his saddlebag. "You miss her?" "I think I miss what I thought she'd be," she said, her voice quiet but not brittle. "She didn't protect me when it counted." He didn't answer right away. The fire caught and threw a low orange light across her hands as she dried them on her skirt. She sat cross-legged near the flames, her knees tucked under, and stared into the glow. "You ever been to Tascosa?" Yates asked after a moment. "No. Old trading post town near the Canadian River. Lot of saloons now, but there's a doctor, a church, dry goods store. Might be a place to start." She looked at him then, really looked, like she was weighing something heavier than his words. "You planning to leave me there? I'll ride as far as you want me to," he said simply. She nodded once, eyes still on his face. "What did you do before this?" "Army scout," he replied. "Mostly rode alone. After the war ended, I stayed west, couldn't take to towns no more." "Why?" He took a long breath and stirred the beans with his knife. "Too many walls. Too many people pretending they ain't carrying ghosts." She didn't speak for a while. The fire cracked between them, wind tugging at the edges of the blanket she'd wrapped around her shoulders. "I used to believe in God," she said finally, "when I was small. Thought if I prayed hard enough, he'd see me, but I stopped when my father died. It felt like talking to a locked door." Yates didn't flinch. "Some doors stay shut," he said, "but it don't mean you're alone outside them." She stared at the flames like they might answer something for her. Then her voice came again, softer. "Why did you stop riding for the army?" "I got tired of tracking things I didn't believe in," he replied. "Started feeling more like a hound than a man." They ate in silence after that. The beans were plain, the coffee bitter, but she didn't complain. When the fire burned lower, she leaned back on her elbows and looked up at the sky. "I forgot how many stars there are," she said. Yates followed her gaze. "They don't go anywhere, just harder to see when you're too close to chimney smoke." She turned her head. "Do you think people can change?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I think they can decide different, and if they keep deciding different long enough, maybe that's change." She nodded slowly. Then, after a pause, "You always talk like that." "Like what?" "Like you've already lived 3 lives and still ain't sure you want this one." Yates gave a quiet chuckle. "Maybe I'm just bad at small talk." "No," she said, her voice low, "I don't think you are." They sat like that for a long time, the fire dimming, the prairie stretching quiet around them. He didn't move closer, didn't touch her. But when she finally laid down and turned her back to the dying coals, she said, "Good night, Yates." He watched the curve of her shoulder rise with each breath. "Good night, Nella." And in the hush that followed, something passed between them, not spoken, not named. Just a steady thing like the land beneath them. Something that might hold. The fourth morning, frost clung to the grass in pale lace. Yates rose before the sun, as he always did, and stoked the fire from the coals left buried beneath ash. Nella still slept, curled tight beneath her coat, one hand resting near her face. Her breaths came slow and steady. He moved quiet, boiling water for the last of the coffee. A coyote padded through the distant scrub and paused to watch, yellow eyes catching light. Yates didn't reach for his rifle. The animal blinked and turned away. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, Nella stirred. She sat up, rubbing her eyes with the heel of her hand, then looked toward the fire without speaking. "There's still some coffee," Yates said, holding out the tin cup. She took it with a nod. "Thank you." He didn't press her to talk. They sat, the silence stretched fine and easy until she cleared her throat. "I used to think if I walked far enough, I'd end up where the past couldn't follow." Yates glanced at her. "And now, I think it walks a little slower is all. But it don't stay behind." She took a sip, then looked toward the wide horizon. "How far to Tascosa? If the horses keep pace, maybe 5 days." She nodded once. "I'll ride there with you." They broke camp and rode south by west, following a line of low ridges that offered shade come midday. That afternoon, they paused near a dry arroyo, and Yates stripped the saddle from her horse to check the withers. He ran his hand along the gelding's back, frowning. "He's sore across the left side," he said. "We'll need to walk him for a while tomorrow." Nella stepped beside him, brow furrowed. "Is there a trick to easing it?" He handed her a shallow tin of tallow. "Rub this in at night, palm it slow with the grain of hair." She took it and crouched beside the horse, fingers moving deliberate and sure. He watched, not out of doubt, but because there was something steady in the way she moved now, like her skin finally fit her bones again. That night, they made camp near a stand of juniper. He caught a jackrabbit and she cleaned it without instruction. They ate in silence, the meat crisped over mesquite coals, and when they finished she gathered the bones and buried them shallow under a flat stone. Yates leaned back, arms folded, watching the stars. "You ever think about settling?" "I did once," she said. "But it always felt like a word meant for someone else. What would make it yours?" She picked at a thread on her sleeve. "I'd need to trust the ground first and the people on it." He didn't say anything. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the dark, a nightjar sang. After a long time, she looked over at him. "Why'd you come west after the war?" "I didn't want anyone telling me how to remember," he said, "or who to be after." She nodded slowly. "I understand that." The wind shifted. A cold edge rode on it. Yates fed a chunk of wood to the fire, then unrolled the spare blanket from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "Thank you," she said, brushing his fingers as she took it. He felt the warmth of that touch longer than made sense. Morning brought a haze that dimmed the sun. They rode slower, walking the horses for an hour to rest the sore gelding. Nella's voice came quiet as they crested a hill. "I keep thinking of my mother's hands. She used to braid my hair in the morning. Always tugged too tight, but her fingers smelled of lavender and lye soap." Yates looked at her, not to interrupt, just to listen. "She died when I was 11. After that, I stopped letting anyone near my hair." She reached up now, pulling a long strand loose from where it had been tucked. "I don't think I could even braid it anymore," he said. "Maybe that's something to relearn." She looked away, but her mouth curved, small and soft. They made camp in a dry hollow that night. The wind was low, and Yates gathered stones for a windbreak. Nella helped, her hands red from the cold, but she worked without complaint. When the fire was steady, she knelt beside him. "You don't ask questions unless you mean to carry the answers. No point asking otherwise. I think I'm ready to tell you something." He waited. "I didn't just leave my uncle's train. I ran after he told the men I was owed to them for passage." Yates didn't move, didn't flinch. His voice stayed steady. "You don't owe anyone your body." "I know that now," she said. "But I didn't then. I thought maybe it was just the way things were. That women had to pay for their space. That ain't the way things are, not if I'm around." She looked at him, and something raw flickered and settled. Then I'll stay near you, she whispered. It wasn't a promise, not quite, but it was a beginning. And when she lay down that night, her bedroll close enough that their hands could brush if they reached, he didn't move away, neither of them reached. Not yet, but neither of them pulled back either. By the 6th day, the land began to rise and fall under their horses' hooves, rougher country where buffalo grass gave way to clusters of scrub oak and red limestone ridges. The air turned drier, the sky wider still. They passed the charred frame of a barn blackened down to the foundation, its roof long gone. Nella said nothing, just held tighter to the reins and kept her eyes forward. That evening they stopped near a shallow creek running cold and swift from recent rain. Yates unsaddled the horses while Nella gathered branches from downed cedar. Her steps were sure now, boots firm in the soil, and her silence had grown companionable, not guarded. Once the fire caught, she sat cross-legged, her fingers working a strip of rawhide into a loop. "There's a woman I met once in Kansas," she said, her tone quiet but steady. "She taught me how to twist leather for snares, said learning to catch your own supper made a person less afraid of empty cupboards." Yates watched the flick of her wrists as she worked. "You thinking of trapping?" "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I just want to remember something useful." He nodded once, then leaned back against his saddle. "I passed through Dodge once, saw a mother teach her boy to shoe a mule with a broken hand. Said he'd better learn while the lesson still hurt." Nella looked up. "Did he?" "He did. Limped half the day but didn't complain once." She smiled, faint and real. "Maybe pain's the only teacher who doesn't lie." The fire snapped, throwing sparks upward. Yates reached to adjust a log, then settled again. "What would you want if you could have something regular?" Her fingers paused. "You mean a life?" He nodded. She tilted her head, considering. "A stove that doesn't smoke, a garden that grows more than weeds. Maybe a porch with shade come afternoon." He let the picture settle between them before asking, "You want that in town?" "No," she said. "Not in town, somewhere with wind and quiet, somewhere I don't have to explain myself." Yates stirred the embers with a stick. "I've got a claim 2 days south of here, nothing planted yet, just a small cabin and a well that hasn't gone dry." She looked over, studying him in the low light. "You live there?" "I was headed back before I found you, figured I'd put up fence this time. Maybe try for a milk cow if I could find one sound and cheap." Nella drew her knees up, wrapped her arms around them. "And you'd be alone out there," he shrugged. "Wasn't planning to be, but I've done it before." She was quiet for a while, then said, "I wouldn't mind seeing it." Yates didn't answer right away. He added another stick to the fire, watching it catch. "You can ride with me there after Tascosa, only if you want." "I'd like that," she said. The night wind came soft through the cottonwoods. Yates laid out the blankets, and when Nella moved to settle in, she paused beside him. "I used to think I'd never trust a man again," she said, "but I don't feel afraid around you." He met her eyes. "You don't have to rush anything." "I'm not," she said, voice low, "but I'd like to sleep beside you tonight, not for anything but warmth and quiet." He moved his bedroll closer without a word. When she lay down, he folded his arm beneath his head, eyes on the stars. After a few moments, she reached across the space between them and let her fingers rest lightly on his sleeve. Neither of them spoke after that. At dawn, she was still beside him, her hand tucked near his ribs, her breathing even. He stayed still until she stirred, then rose to tend the horses while she rubbed warmth into her hands and packed the blankets. Later that morning, they crossed a low ridge and saw the rooftops of Tascosa in the distance. From up there, it looked like a scattering of timber and smoke pressed against the river bend. Nella pulled her horse alongside his. "You ever think of what kind of woman you'd want if you settled proper?" He didn't look at her when he answered. "Someone who knows silence ain't a punishment. Someone who doesn't flinch at hard work or hard truths." She nodded. "Sounds like you'd need someone who's lived through fire." "I reckon so." She didn't speak again until the road leveled out. Then she said, "I'll ride with you to your claim, Yates." "Not just to look." He glanced her way, and this time their eyes held. "All right," he said, and that was all either of them needed. They left Tascosa the next morning, the town already stirring with wagons creaking down the main street and a blacksmith hammering somewhere behind the livery. Nella didn't look back. She rode beside Yates, her satchel tied behind her saddle and her eyes forward. The land south of the Canadian River was drier, scattered with low cedar breaks and shallow gullies carved by spring floods. They followed a faint wagon trail that wound between stone outcrops and sloped down through a narrow ravine. Around noon, Yates paused atop a ridge and pointed. "Cabins down there." Nella shaded her eyes. At first she saw only sage and rock, then the shape emerged a low, square-roofed structure built from rough-hewn pine. A lean-to stood beside it, and behind that, a small, fenced pen. A windmill rose crookedly at the edge of the clearing, its blades still in the calm. As they rode down, she saw the well, the door hung straight, and a single row of flat stones marking a path from porch to gate. Yates dismounted and opened the latch. "It ain't much, but it's dry and doesn't lean." Inside, the place was cool and dim. A pot-bellied stove stood in the corner, cold now but clean. A narrow cot sat against the far wall with a folded quilt at its foot. There was a table, a single chair, and shelves lined with a few tin plates and a clay jug. Nella stepped inside, her fingers brushing the doorframe. "You built this," he nodded. "Used to ride out, work a week at a time, brought lumber in with a neighbor's wagon." She walked to the window and looked out at the open space beyond. "It feels honest." "I tried to make it so." She turned, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she crossed to the table and set down her satchel. "I'll need a place to wash. That creek nearby, east of the fence. Water's clear, runs strong." She started toward the door, then paused. "You'll leave the door open?" "I will." He watched her go, the soft sound of her boots fading over packed earth. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. That evening, she returned with her sleeves damp and her hair pulled back with a strip of cotton. She had gathered a small bundle of wild onions, which she set on the table without explanation. Yates peeled and chopped them while she sliced the last of the salt pork. They cooked together, moving without instruction. After they ate, Nella stood near the hearth, her hand resting on the edge of the mantel. "I never had a home that didn't come with rules nailed to the walls," she said. "This place feels like it could be something I choose." Yates leaned against the frame of the doorway, arms crossed. "You can make it as much yours as mine." She looked at him, her voice low. "You sure about that?" "I wouldn't have brought you here if I wasn't." She stepped toward him, each footfall quiet on the plank floor. "I'm not the same woman who climbed out of that gully. I know. I don't want to be beholden, not ever again." "You're not," he said. "You're free here and want it if you want to stay." Her fingers reached for his, slow, deliberate. He met her halfway. "I want to," she said. Yates brought her hand to his chest, his heart thudding steady beneath it. "Then stay." She leaned into him, and he gathered her close, his arms strong around her waist. No heat of surprise, no urgency, just the quiet certainty of two people who had walked through fire and come out whole. Weeks passed, and spring came in earnest. They planted a small patch of squash and beans behind the cabin, using water from the creek and ash from the stove to enrich the soil. Nella took to keeping a ledger of what they grew, what they traded for with a neighbor 2 ridges over. She mended his shirts, and he built her a second chair, carving a small star into the top rail because she liked the night sky. They slept beside each other each night, her head tucked beneath his chin, his hand resting against her back. The silence between them had shifted, no longer cautious but companionable, full of unspoken understanding. One day, as they sat on the porch watching the horizon smudge purple with dusk, Nella looked over at him. "I never thought I'd want to say this out loud," she said, voice steady, "but I'm glad those men chased me. If they hadn't, I never would have found you." Yates took her hand, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "I think about that too. How something cruel turned me toward something good." "I love you," she said. "Not because I owe you or because you saved me, but because you saw me when I didn't think I could be seen." He turned to her, his voice low and certain. "And I love you. Because you stayed, and because you don't flinch from truth." They kissed, slow and sure, the kind of kiss shaped by long days and quiet nights, by split firewood and shared coffee, by trust built one wordless moment at a time. They married that May, standing beneath the cottonwoods near the creek. Their only witnesses were the neighbor and his wife and the wind moving through the grass. Nella wore her hair down, and Yates wore the cleanest shirt she'd mended. Together, they carved out a life neither had dared to imagine, one not of survival, but of belonging. Years later, the cabin would hold the laughter of children and the scent of bread baking. But even then, in the quiet moments, they would still sit together at the edge of the porch, hands entwined, hearts steady, and neither would ever need to speak the words again to know them true.